His body was found 3 days later, floating in the icy waters of the East River, an anonymous end for a man who dared to dream too big. No one could explain how such a meticulous figure, aware of the dangers of the underworld, ended up floating like mere debris, his swollen face unrecognizable. This is the untold story of the fatal mistake that drowned him, a brutal lesson on the nature of power in Harlem. The truth about his downfall wasn't shouted from the rooftops, but whispered in the calculated silence of a man who turned quietude into his most lethal weapon. Let's unravel what really happened in those days leading up to his death, delving into the mind of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson and the mistake of a man who confused patience with weakness, a deception that cost him absolutely everything. The story serves as a grim map to the heart of Bumpy's empire, where loyalty was the only law and betrayal was a final sentence. It was a cold winter night in 1948, and Harlem was shrouded in a fog that seemed to emanate as much from the weather as from the latent tension in the streets. Inside the Rhythm Club, one of the many establishments under Bumpy Johnson's discreet control, the sound of jazz was a vibrant counterpoint to the heavy silence that had settled in the back office. There, far from the laughter and music, true power manifested itself. Bumpy sat behind his polished mahogany desk, not like a gangster, but like a monarch in his court. The air was thick with the smell of expensive whiskey and the bluish smoke of a Cuban cigar, an atmosphere that for many was one of success, but that night it was the prelude to a trial. Freddie, one of his most efficient and until then reliable collectors, stood before him, sweat glistening on his brow despite the cold. The week's money was on the table, but the pile was visibly smaller than it should have been. Bumpy hadn't counted it. He didn't need to. He already knew, and his silence was the first piece to be moved on the board. Freddie's mistake didn't begin with the theft itself, but with the arrogance that preceded it. He was young, ambitious, and in his mind, smarter than the old guard. He saw Bumpy Johnson as a relic of a bygone era, a man whose reputation surpassed his current capabilities. For weeks he observed his boss's style, the calmness, the delegation of tasks, the apparent detachment from day-to-day operations. Freddie interpreted this confidence as carelessness. He began to embezzle small amounts, testing the waters, and when no consequences followed, his audacity grew. He bought a new car, a luxury that didn't go unnoticed, and began to flaunt it in circles where discretion was a virtue for survival. He believed that in the vast and complex financial machinery of Bumpy's empire, his small diversions would be merely a rounding error, statistical noise. He didn't understand that, for Bumpy, every penny had a story, and he was the most eager of listeners. Freddie's greed deafened him to the most fundamental truth of Harlem. Nothing happened without Bumpy Johnson knowing about it. Post-war Harlem was a universe of dualities. To the outside world, it was a ghetto, a stain of poverty and crime on the map of Manhattan. But inside, it was a vibrant kingdom, a cultural capital with a complex social and economic hierarchy. Black soldiers returned from World War II with a new perspective on freedom and equality, only to find the same, if not worse, conditions they left behind. This collective frustration created a power vacuum that men like Bumpy Johnson masterfully filled. He wasn't just a criminal, he was an institution. He was the bank that lent money when official banks refused, the judge who resolved disputes that would never reach a court, and the protector who ensured that local merchants were not exploited by outsiders. His authority was not sanctioned by the state, but by the ordinary people of Harlem, who saw him as a twisted but effective form of justice and order. He understood that lasting power was not based solely on fear, but on a symbiosis with the community he governed. To maintain this delicate balance, Bumpy Johnson built one of the most sophisticated information networks in New York. His intelligence didn't come from paid underworld informants, but from the very fabric of Harlem. The shoeshine boy on the corner of 125th Street, the waitress serving coffee at the diner, the newsboy shouting the day's headlines. All were his eyes and ears. This loyalty wasn't coerced. It was cultivated. Bumpy ensured the shoeshine boy's grandmother had coal for the winter, that the waitress's son got a spot in a summer program. He invested in people, and they repaid him with the only currency he truly valued, pure, unfiltered information. When Freddie started spending money he didn't have, the news traveled through this invisible network, rising from whispers in bars to conversations in barbershops, until it inevitably reached Bumpy's ears. He didn't need an accountant to find the discrepancy. The community itself had reported the betrayal long before that fateful night at the Rhythm Club. The figure of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was a study in contrasts. Publicly, he was a patron of the arts, a regular at jazz clubs and poetry readings, a man who could discuss the work of Langston Hughes with the same ease as he discussed the odds in a horse race. He dressed with sober elegance, his suits always impeccable, his shoes gleaming. This facade of a refined gentleman was not entirely a performance. He was genuinely an intellectual, a voracious reader of history, philosophy, and military strategy. In his apartment, Machiavelli and Sun Tzu shared shelf space with W.E.B. Du Bois. This intellectual depth was what fundamentally distinguished him from his rivals. While other gangsters saw the world as a series of confrontations to be won by force, Bumpy saw it as a large chessboard, where positioning, patience, and the ability to sacrifice a pawn to capture a queen were the keys to long-term victory. This chess-playing mentality defined his every move. He was a master of psychological warfare, understanding that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself. He projected a calmness that was deeply unsettling. In meetings with boisterous and expansive Italian mobsters, Bumpy's quietness dominated the room. His eyes, which seemed to register everything, and his economy of words forced others to fill the silence, often revealing more than they intended. He had learned that the man who controls the pace of the conversation controls the situation. His reputation was built on swift and terrible acts of retribution, but these acts were always a calculated response, never an impulsive reaction. He allowed minor transgressions to pass, not out of ignorance, but to observe a man's pattern of behavior, to give him enough rope to hang himself. It was a strategy that demanded ironclad patience and absolute confidence in his own judgment. Within his empire, Bumpy operated by a moral code that, though distorted by conventional standards, was absolute and unbreakable. Loyalty was the central pillar of his universe. He could forgive mistakes, lapses in judgment, and even financial losses. But betrayal was the cardinal sin, an offense that demanded complete eradication. He was known for his almost paternal generosity towards those loyal to him, paying medical expenses, funding their children's education, and ensuring their families never went hungry. This generosity, however, had a dark side. It created a debt that was not financial, but moral. By accepting his protection and patronage, his men entered into a pact. In exchange for security and prosperity, they owed him unquestionable loyalty. Breaking this pact was not merely an act of disloyalty, it was a violation of the very natural order of his world, an imbalance that needed to be corrected in an exemplary manner. Returning to that night at the Rhythm Club, Bumpy Johnson's silence was a vacuum that Freddie, in his growing panic, felt the need to fill. And he did so with lies. He began to weave an elaborate story about a police raid that forced him to drop the money, about a merchant who had become an informant, and about the need to act cautiously. Each word was a shovelful of dirt into his own grave. Bumpy listened, impassive, his head slightly tilted like a scholar analyzing a flawed text. He didn't interrupt him. He allowed Freddie to build his own verbal prison, brick by brick. Freddie's initial arrogance disintegrated, replaced by a sweaty despair. He didn't understand that this silence wasn't a space for him to explain himself, but a stage for him to expose himself. It was a final test of character, the last chance Bumpy gave him to confess, to show a glimpse of honor amidst his betrayal. And Freddie was failing spectacularly. The trap wasn't an ambush in a dark alley, it was a confrontation in a closed room, where the only weapons were words and the weight of truth. After Freddie had exhausted his repertoire of lies, Bumpy finally broke his silence. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He asked a simple, disarming question about Freddie's new car. He complimented it, asked about its performance, its color, its cost. Each question was calm, conversational, but to Freddie, each one sounded like a hammer blow to a coffin nail. He stammered, tried to give vague answers, but the precision of Bumpy's questions showed that he knew more than he was saying. The tension in the room became physical, a pressure on Freddy's chest. Bumpy then, with the same composure, began to deconstruct the lie about the police raid, mentioning the name of the sergeant on duty that night, a man on his payroll who hadn't reported any incident. Freddy's web unraveled thread by thread. The tipping point was reached when Bumpy, with surgical coldness, mentioned the name of Freddy's mistress and the expensive gift he had given him the previous week, a necklace bought with money belonging to the Empire. At that instant, pure and utter terror gripped Freddy's face. He understood with paralyzing clarity the extent of his boss's omniscience. He realized he wasn't being confronted with a robbery that had just been discovered, but with a betrayal that had been observed and documented for weeks. The office door was locked, but that wasn't the real prison. Freddy was trapped in Bumpy's web of information, a web from which there was no escape. The underestimation he felt for Bumpy transformed into reverential dread. He wasn't facing an aging gangster. He was facing a force of nature that he, in his folly, had tried to deceive. The turning point was theatrical in its simplicity. Bumpy rose slowly and walked to the small bar in the corner of the office. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the sound of the liquid being poured and the ice clinking the only noises in the room. He turned and extended one of the glasses to Freddy. "A toast," said Bumpy, his voice uninflected, "to new beginnings and necessary endings." It wasn't an offer of peace, it was a closing ritual. Freddy, his hands trembling uncontrollably, took the glass. His eyes were fixed on Bumpy, searching for a sign of mercy, of anger, of anything, but found only a calm, resolute emptiness. Bumpy's control was absolute. He didn't need to raise his voice or draw a weapon. He had stripped Freddy of his arrogance, his lies, and finally, his hope. The act of accepting the drink was Freddy's final surrender, a silent acknowledgement that his fate was no longer in his hands. The aftermath was as silent as the confrontation. As Freddy drank his whiskey in a single desperate gulp, the office door swung open. 2 of Bumpy's most loyal men, who had been waiting in the hallway the entire time, entered the room. Their movements were efficient, devoid of emotion. There was no struggle, not a word exchanged. They simply positioned themselves beside Freddy, who remained paralyzed, the empty glass slipping from his fingers and falling onto the thick carpet. They lifted him by the chair and guided him out into the cold Harlem night. He didn't protest. He was a hollow man, already a ghost before his body even disappeared. Bumpy remained in his office, finishing his own whiskey as he listened to the footsteps receding down the hallway. Freddy's physical execution was a mere formality. His true annihilation had taken place in that very room. The message sent by that event was a true act of power. Freddy's disappearance wasn't announced. He simply ceased to exist. The next day, a young and ambitious collector was promoted to take over Freddy's route. The operation continued uninterrupted, as if Freddy had never been a part of it. But the story spread, not as news, but as a whisper, an urban legend told in hushed tones in barbershops and clubs. The story wasn't about a robbery, but about the silence that preceded it. The symbol left behind wasn't a bullet-riddled body in an alley, but an eloquent void. Freddy's absence became a monument to Bumpy's omnipresence and the futility of betrayal. The lesson was clear and terrifying. Bumpy Johnson didn't punish disloyalty with pain, but with oblivion. He could erase a man not only from life, but from the very history of Harlem. The historic impact of that night solidified the myth of Bumpy Johnson for the next decade. He set a precedent that would be remembered by all who operated in his shadow. Bumpy's silence was not a sign of weakness or ignorance, but the sound of a trap being set. This single event served as a more effective control mechanism than an army of henchmen. It instilled a kind of fear that went beyond the physical, a psychological fear of being considered insignificant, of simply being wiped off the board. The legend of the collector who disappeared into the night became one of the cornerstones of Bumpy's reign, a constant reminder that, in the dangerous game for control of Harlem, the most powerful move is often not seen nor heard, but felt in the spine of every player. This story serves as a grim reminder of the complexity of power. It demonstrates that true dominance is not exercised through brute force, but through a deep understanding of human nature, its weaknesses, its vanities, and its fear of the unknown. Bumpy Johnson was not merely a crime boss, he was a master of psychology, and his greatest victory was not accumulating wealth, but controlling the narrative, transforming his own quietness into a force of nature. Freddy's story is not just about a man who died, it's about a principle that was established. In a world built on reputation, mistaking a king's calculated silence for weakness is not just a mistake, it's an act of abdicating one's own existence. The narrative of the Underworld is written with the stories of those who were bold and those who were wise enough to know the difference. By delving into these annals, we discover that the most significant wars are rarely declared with a bang. They begin with a whisper, with a glance, with a silence that stretches on too long. The rise and fall of powerful men is an eternal cycle, and understanding the mistakes that precipitate the downfall is key to understanding the very nature of power. The story of Bumpy Johnson and his unfaithful collector is more than a crime tale. It is a timeless parable about strategy, perception, and the ultimate price of arrogance, an echo that still resonates in the historic streets of Harlem.